Our text is from Joshua 6, verses 1 through 5 and 12 to 17. Hear the word of the Lord. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in." Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord while the trumpets kept sounding. So, on the 2nd day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak, marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab, the prostitute, and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Hello, High Rock. I'm John, one of the pastors here, and it is my privilege to join you in addressing another good question today. We asked you all what questions you have about God, the Bible, or any matters of faith, and you answered with your questions. One of those questions was about violence, and it came with 2 parts to the question. One part asked, what about divinely ordained, premeditated violence in the Bible, such as the destruction of Jericho? Why would God sanction such bloodshed? And how do you square that violence with Jesus' teaching that we should love our enemies? The second part of that question was whether it was ever okay for Christians to use violence, such as in self-defense. Now that's a big question, and we definitely do not have time to address both parts of that question. So I had to choose. Do I address the question of divine genocide, or do I address the question of self-defense? Have you ever heard the saying that fools rush in where angels fear to tread? Apparently, I'm a fool, because I chose Jericho, as you can tell from today's scripture reading. Actually, I hope that I'm not being a fool. I do not pretend to know the answer to this question. I have some ideas, but I'm telling you now, I do not know the answer to this question. But I do trust the God who does know the answer. And I will do my best to share why this question matters so much and how my understanding of the question itself has changed over time. So why does God tell Israel to destroy Jericho? The final verse of today's passage puts it this way: "The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent." The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. That sounds nice, almost redemptive. The word for devoted is herem, a Hebrew word referring to setting aside something for only the king's use. And in this case, God is their king. And how do you devote something to God? Well, typically, you burn it to ash or utterly destroy it. Whoa, that sounds a lot different. Everything in the city is to be devoted to the Lord. So silver and gold and everything that breathes, cattle, sheep, goats, even cats and dogs and gerbils and hamsters if they had them. It all belongs to God. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Straight talk? That sounds a lot like genocide. And it points to a deeper question than a simple question about violence. It goes to the heart of who this God is and whether or not the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament are even the same God at all. So here is the deeper question. Does God love the Canaanites too. The Canaanites are all the various inhabitants of the Promised Land who were there before Israel arrived. Does God love them too, or does God love only certain people? I believe that this is probably the most important ethical question in the entire Old Testament. What are we to make of God's commands to kill every living thing in an entire city? Whether atheist or Christian or something in between, many of us have struggled to answer this question, and our answer says a lot about who we think God is and whether or not we believe in that God at all. Even if you don't ask this question yourself, my guess is that someone else has asked you this question, maybe as an objection. In other words, whoever you are, I think this question is absolutely critical. And my attempt at an answer is highly influenced by the very helpful work of a philosopher and theologian, Paul Copan, in his book, Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God. That book came out in 2010 and was so well received that Copan joins another scholar to write a follow-up book, Did God Really Command Genocide? Coming to Terms with the Justice of God. Based on their work and my own wrestling with this question, I want to share some broad points to consider as you wrestle with this question yourself. First, figures of speech. Culture and language change a lot over time. Hebrew figures of speech from 3,000 years ago in the book of Joshua are hard to square with our modern English vocabulary. Even within English, it's not easy to read Shakespeare. That's technically our language, and that's only a few hundred years old. OMG, even millennials struggle to understand Gen Alpha with terms like skibbity, Ohio, and phantom tax, which is my personal favorite. I love collecting phantom tax from my kids. So yeah, 3,000 years and a different language? Understanding figures of speech in that context? That takes some work. And then there's the fact that in some contexts, the job is not to communicate facts, but to communicate feelings. Sometimes we say things that are not literally true. It's just how you say things in that context. For instance, how many of you have been told by your significant other that you are the most beautiful or handsome person in the world to them? Well, maybe we need to schedule a relationship seminar. Okay, when your significant other said that, what did you think? Did you really think that you were the most beautiful or handsome person in the world? Or did you think it was just a way of expressing how much they love and adore you? It's not a lie. It's not even really an exaggeration. It's a metaphor, an idiom. It's pillow talk. Let's flip it around. When a Marine drill instructor tells a recruit that he's going to rip off his head and spit down his throat, does he literally mean it? Or is he just using an accepted figure of speech, a cliche even, to communicate an important idea? Sometimes, depending on the context, the figure of speech will be an understatement rather than an overstatement. If Tony Soprano tells you to take care of that guy, he doesn't mean you should take care of him. He means you should take care of him. You know what I'm saying. So when God says to destroy every living thing in a city, does God literally mean it, or is God simply speaking to us in a way that we might speak to one another? Well, archaeologists have found numerous tablets and monuments where they make similar claims of total destruction, even when everyone knew for a fact that total destruction did not occur. The Merneptah stele, or a stone slab, contains perhaps the earliest mention of Israel outside the Bible. That stone slab is taller than me, and it's from over 3,000 years ago. And in it, the king of Egypt claims to have destroyed every last person of Israel, which we know isn't literally true, which they knew was literally not true. It's like the drill instructor who says he's going to rip your head off, or the significant other who says you're the most attractive person they know. It's something they're supposed to say. You'd be wondering what's wrong if they don't say it. There are numerous examples where this happens with Egyptian kings, Moabite kings, Hittite kings, Assyrian kings. In other words, ancient Near East kings universally used the language of total destruction when total destruction did not literally occur, nor was it even intended. If God spoke in much milder language, would anyone even take it seriously? I mean, what if a Marine drill instructor, instead of saying, "I'm going to rip your head off," said, "I'm going to be really disappointed in you"? I just don't think that would work. Now, that observation about figures of speech by itself wouldn't be enough. Just because the surrounding culture or the people do it doesn't mean that Joshua does it or that God does it. God sometimes speaks to us in our language and culture, but sometimes God challenges that culture. But in the Bible itself, we can see that the Bible uses those same figures of speech. In Joshua 11:21, it says that Joshua destroyed all the Anakites in the land. But just 4 chapters later, those Anakites are still there, and Caleb is getting permission from Joshua to fight them in the hill country. Similarly, in 3 places in Joshua 11, it says that Joshua drove out all the Canaanites from the land. But the very next book of the Bible, Judges, starts by listing the numerous Canaanite people who were still in the land. Sometimes all doesn't actually mean all. The first people to attack Israel after they left Egypt, the Amalekites, they were supposedly destroyed. But hundreds of years later, we get to the Babylonian captivity in the book of Esther, and who do we see trying to kill all the Jewish people? Haman. And Haman was an Amalekite. Sometimes all doesn't literally mean all. Sometimes the ancient Near East peoples want to communicate an emotional reality, like when Jonah says he was in the belly of the whale forever. It was 3 days, and it was also forever. I get it. Sort of like going to the RMV. Some modern readers might object and say that Joshua lied or put words in God's mouth, or exaggerated. However, I'm inclined to agree with scholars who believe that God was simply using the accepted language of the day. He was speaking in a way that the people would understand. Still, we don't know for certain. Just the other day, Dr. Scott and I were talking about how we see this topic differently, and we still like each other, and are going to talk about this more. So let's move on to a second point to consider. Jericho was not a city. What do you mean Jericho is not a city? Well, when the Old Testament calls a place a city, it might mean a large walled city like Jerusalem, but it could also mean a fortified camp. And all the archaeological evidence says that Jericho and the other towns marked for destruction were not normal towns. They were fortresses built at key spots along trading routes. They were places where soldiers and government officials held office. These types of cities were often at crossroads and served as a safe stopping place for traveling merchants. Dig after dig at cities like Jericho turn up no decorative jewelry, no house decorations, no ornate pottery, none of the evidence that shows that families would actually live there. Plus, Jericho and Ai were small, filled with a garrison of soldiers. There would have been no room for families. Civilians lived in the surrounding towns and countryside. All the evidence points to there being few women and certainly no children present. Rahab's presence is the exception that proves the rule. These fortress towns often had an inn built into the outer wall, just like Rahab's place is described. These inns often functioned as brothels. Perhaps more interesting, these inns were often a weak point in the fortress's security, so much so that the Hittite kingdom ended up banning all such inns within their fortress towns. In other words, details about Rahab corroborate that Jericho was one of these military encampments. But even if God wasn't just using a contemporary figure of speech, and even if Jericho was more than just a fortress and had some women and children, there's one more reason to believe women and children or other non-combatants were not killed. Because there were many warnings. First of all, the Canaanites had 40 years of warning. Rahab herself said that they had all heard about what God had done for them to humiliate the Egyptians, the greatest empire in the world at that time. For people like Rahab, that was a good enough reason to accept that Israel's God truly was God. For others, like the people of Jericho, the humiliation of Egypt was reason for fear rather than faith. But that's your story and my story too, isn't it? When we see evidence of God's presence, it can produce fear or faith. It all depends on the attitude of our hearts. There were many others who responded to God with faith rather than fear. When Israel left Egypt, there was a mixed multitude of other nations that joined them. Caleb, Joshua's right-hand man, was one of that mixed multitude. The Gibeonites, a Canaanite group, even made a covenant with Israel. In fact, God later punished King Saul and all of Israel when King Saul violated the covenant that was made with those Canaanites. I bring all this up just to point out that people had a lot of time, even decades, to consider their options. And in case after case, God spared those who asked for mercy. Not only spared them, but often included them into the people of God. And then consider the attack on Jericho itself. Do you remember how many days they marched around the city? 7 days. Jericho had 7 days to consider their options. And even before that, Rahab makes clear that they knew the Israelites had crossed the Jordan. They even knew that spies had come to Jericho. In the face of imminent attack, isn't it likely that women and children left beforehand, if they were even there in the first place? I mean, just days ago, people in Iran read a social media post that suggested that they might want to evacuate the city of Tehran, and immediately the highways were flooded with cars fleeing the city. And so after 40 years of marching through the desert and then 7 days marching around the city, if there had been any women and children in Jericho, would they have stayed? So, in broad strokes, those are some of the points to consider before we assume that God called for genocide. And with all that in mind, we return to the question at hand. Does God love the Canaanites too? Given that God may have been using common figures of speech, and given that Jericho was probably a military fortress, and given that God gave ample warning, including miraculous signs and wonders, it might give us reason to suspect that God might not be the vengeful, bloodthirsty avenger that we imagine. What's even more important to remember is that God gave a promise to Abraham in Genesis 12, not just to bless Israel, but to bless the whole world. For God so loved the world, not just Israel. God's desire was to bless even the Canaanites. One factor that most people don't notice is how patient God had been with the Canaanites for hundreds of years before Israel entered the Promised Land. Over 400 years before Jericho, God gave Abraham that promise in Genesis 12. And then God told Abraham that Israel would be prisoners in Egypt for those intervening 400 years. Why would God allow his people to suffer for so long? Because the Amorites, the Canaanites, were not yet beyond redemption. The sin of the Amorites had not gotten as bad as it could get. But by the time 400 years had passed, by the time Israel left Egypt and crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land, Canaanite sin had reached its fullness. It had gotten so bad that many people refused to turn away from their sins. They refused to accept God as their God. Instead, they held on to their pagan idols that led them into all kinds of sins that are unmentionable, especially with kids in the room. Sins that are listed out in detail in Leviticus 20. All their detestable and inhuman practices were a direct result of living out what they saw in the stories and rituals of their false gods. Real beliefs in false gods have very real consequences. God had nothing against the Canaanites as people. It's not that he wanted to drive ethnic Canaanites out of the land. What he wanted to drive out were their horrific religious practices and corrupted morality. But for the most part, the Canaanites refused to let go of these horrible sins. Again, I want to emphasize that I do not have an answer to this question of divine violence. But over the years, I have come across these broad observations that challenge some of the assumptions in the question, and I hope that they're helpful to you. But where I have even greater clarity is the danger of confident but false understandings of what is happening in these violent scenes. For one thing, some people find justification for their own violent desires in passages like this one. People are observing that Vance Belter may have had religious motivations for his recent crimes, and there are videos of him preaching overseas in a missions context. Now, what happened with Moses and Joshua as leaders of an entire nation without a home cannot rightly be used by an individual. Moses spoke with God, and his spiritual leadership was testified to by signs and wonders. Moses then passed that mantle of leadership on to Joshua. Joshua's leadership of the nation was then validated when he led the Israelites through the Jordan River miraculously on dry land. And the attack on Jericho itself was commanded to Joshua by God. In fact, before they first march around Jericho, Joshua had an encounter with a man outside the city. Joshua wanted to know if this man was a friend or enemy. Was he for us or against us? Are you on their side or on our side? And the man replied, I'm not on anyone's side. I'm in charge. The question is, are you on my side, Joshua? So whether it's Vance Belter or the Crusaders or anyone else looking for a divine sanction for violence, you're not going to find it here. Not unless you encounter the living God like Joshua and fall to the ground in worship. And like Joshua, have the community of faith confirm your divine calling. And that's why we take ordination seriously. Anyone can claim that they're being led by God. But are there others who confirm and affirm their calling and character? We human beings are so often looking to make sure God is on our side, or convince others that God is on our side in order to justify the unjustifiable actions we want to take. The Battle of Jericho should remind us that God is not on our side against someone else. That's not even the right question. The question is whether we are on God's side. The would-be crusaders of the world will not find justification for their violence here, though they might convince themselves otherwise. The real answer to the question is yes. God does love the Canaanites too. And the ugly moment we see in the Battle of Jericho has to be understood as the last stand of a violent and unjust society of Canaanites who refused to change their ways for decades and even longer. Beyond that point, I still feel there is a lot of uncertainty in any answer to the question about if and when violence is justified. I have some personal opinions that I would be happy to share in private conversation. But I will share this. In all my years of struggling with issues around violence, there is one divine interaction that haunts me. When I was a police officer in the Chicago suburbs, I had to wrestle with this question. And while I could find ample justification for violence in self-defense or violence in defense of others, there was one scene in the Bible that I could not shake. King David long wanted to be the one to build God's house. It bothered David's conscience that he lived in a luxurious palace while God lived in the tabernacle, a movable tent, sort of a mobile home. Instead, David wanted to build a temple, a permanent home for God, a building even more grand than the king's palace. What an act of devotion. David wanted to make sure that whatever he had, God had something better. David wanted to give the best to God and live on the leftovers. Imagine what our community might be like if we all lived with that same spirit. Except for one thing. God said no. God would not let David build God's house. And that really caught my attention because while I was a police officer, I was catching a vision, maybe a calling to be a pastor. I wanted to build God's house too. But God said no to David. Why? David shared that God said to me, "You may not build a house for my name, for you are a man of war and have shed blood." God's house would be a house of peace, and it would be built by a person of peace. Despite all the historical, theological, biblical, and philosophical justifications I could come up with for violence, I could not shake that haunting no from God to David. Did I want to build a house for God's name? Yes. Then I too must be a person of peace, just like Jesus was a person of peace. Is violence ever justified? I think I will wrestle with that question until the day I die. And maybe that's how it's supposed to be. Maybe the answer is that, yes, violence is sometimes justified, but if I ever become comfortable with that answer, I will have lost sight of who God is and who Jesus invites me to be as I follow him. If I ever become too comfortable with an answer that justifies violence, I will likely have forgotten that, yes, God does love the Canaanites too. Jesus didn't just die for me or for you, but for all people. For God so loved the world, the cosmos, the entire cosmos, that he gave us his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him might not perish, but have eternal life. Any answer to our question that loses sight of that fact has to be wrong. Jesus is the answer, whatever our question may be. Again, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. I hope I haven't been a fool today. And if I have, I hope you will forgive me and that God will forgive me. In the end, what I most deeply desire, what I hope that you will most deeply desire, is to be the person of peace who builds up the house of God. Amen.